You don't belong here. Get up, move along. The officer's voice was cold, cutting through the quiet buzz of the neighborhood park like a blade. The elderly woman, her hands shaking as she stacked the last of the sandwiches for the community event, turned to face him. Her voice, steady but heavy with disbelief, replied, "I'm here to help people. That's all." But it wasn't enough. The officer's sneer deepened as he jabbed a finger at the modest food table she had set up, a table that had been a lifeline for so many in the struggling neighborhood. "This isn't your property. This is public land, and you don't have a permit. You're trespassing." "I've been doing this for years," she said, her voice still calm but laced with indignation. "Nobody's ever had a problem before." The officer took a deliberate step forward, towering over her fragile frame. "Well, I've got a problem now," he snapped. His hand shot out, tipping the table over. Containers of food spilled onto the ground. Gasps rippled through the small crowd gathered nearby, their hesitant murmurs growing louder as the scene unfolded. "What are you doing? This isn't right," she protested, bending down to retrieve the scattered sandwiches. But the officer's hand clamped onto her wrist, yanking her upright with a force that made her wince. "You're resisting now, huh? Maybe a little time in the dirt will remind you to follow orders." Before she could respond, he dragged her to a nearby trash bin. The crowd was frozen in shock, unsure whether to intervene or keep their heads down. The officer pulled out zip ties, binding her wrists to the handle of the bin, leaving her standing humiliated, tethered like garbage. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Her gaze remained fixed on him, unyielding, as if her dignity refused to be tied down no matter how much he tried to strip it away. "You think this makes you strong?" she said, her voice barely a whisper, but every word hit like a hammer. "You're just another criminal hiding behind a badge," she added, her quiet defiance louder than any scream. The officer smirked, adjusting his belt. "Say whatever you want. Nobody's coming to save you. People like you don't get heroes." But just as the words left his mouth, a truck roared into the parking lot, gravel spitting under its tires. A man stepped out, his figure commanding, his badge gleaming under the sun. There was an unmistakable intensity in his eyes as they locked onto the scene unfolding before him. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched, and in that moment, it was clear that this was no ordinary bystander. This was someone who would demand answers, and justice. The air was electric, heavy with tension as the two men stared each other down. The crowd sensed it too, a shift in the atmosphere, as if justice itself had just stepped into the scene. The woman's bound wrists trembled slightly, but her voice was steady as she called out, "You shouldn't have come here for me. It's not worth the trouble." The man didn't take his eyes off the officer. His voice, low and commanding, carried across the park. "Oh, it's worth every second. You're not getting away with this." What followed would shake the very foundation of the community and uncover truths no one expected. What would happen next? How far would this man go to right the wrong done to his mother? And what price would the officer pay for his unchecked cruelty? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our Black audience. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. This channel is a space where stories of justice, resilience, and humanity are celebrated, and your voice matters deeply. We thank you for being here and hope this story resonates with the truth of standing tall against injustice. If you enjoy what we do, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us in spreading these powerful messages. Now, sit back and get ready for an unforgettable story. Let's begin. The sun hung low over the small, struggling neighborhood, casting long shadows across the worn-out playground and cracked basketball court. The park, modest but lively, was the heart of the community. It was where families gathered, where kids laughed and played until dusk, and where people like Delilah Carter worked tirelessly to keep the spirit of togetherness alive. Delilah was a woman of quiet strength. At 68 years old, her back carried the weight of decades of sacrifice, but her eyes still held the spark of a fighter. A retired nurse, she had dedicated her life to helping others, both in the hospital and in her neighborhood. Every Sunday, she set up a modest table in the park to distribute sandwiches, fruit, and bottled water to anyone who needed it. For Delilah, it wasn't charity, it was love. It was her way of standing against the tide of poverty and hopelessness that seemed to grip her corner of the city tighter every year. Her son, Marcus Carter, had inherited her drive but forged his own path. As the sheriff of the county, Marcus was known for his fairness and unyielding dedication to justice. Unlike many who wore the badge, he didn't see it as a symbol of authority but as a tool to protect and uplift the vulnerable. His position wasn't just a job, it was a responsibility. Marcus had grown up in this very neighborhood, witnessing its struggles firsthand, and now he used every ounce of his influence to advocate for his community. To him, every decision he made carried the weight of his mother's teachings, compassion, strength, and an unshakable sense of right and wrong. That morning, Marcus had stopped by Delilah's house for coffee, a routine they shared whenever his schedule allowed. Her small home, modest and warm, was filled with framed photos of family and keepsakes from her years of service. They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains as the smell of fresh brewed coffee filled the room. "You don't have to do this every week, Ma," Marcus said, a teasing lilt in his voice. "You've done enough for this community. Let someone else take the reins for once." Delilah chuckled softly, stirring cream into her cup. "Marcus, you know better than anyone that some things you don't retire from. Besides, if I don't show up, who's going to remind these kids there's still kindness in the world?" Her words stuck with him as he drove to the station later that morning. Marcus had always admired his mother's resilience, but a small part of him worried about her safety. She was tough, no doubt about that, but the world wasn't always kind to people like Delilah, people who refused to stay silent, who dared to stand tall in the face of injustice. At the park, Delilah was in her element. Her small folding table was set up under a tree, shaded from the mid-afternoon sun. A handful of kids ran up to her, their faces lighting up as she handed out juice boxes and sandwiches. The smiles she saw made it all worthwhile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her why she did this, why she kept coming back, week after week, despite the aches in her joints and the whispers of doubt from friends who told her it wasn't safe to stick her neck out. Across the park, however, trouble was brewing. Officer Daniel Barnes, a man who had earned a reputation for his heavy-handed tactics, had parked his patrol car and was watching the scene unfold from a distance. Barnes had been on the force for nearly a decade, but his presence in the neighborhood was rarely seen as protective. To many, he was a symbol of the systemic problems that plagued law enforcement, a man more interested in control than service. Barnes had always carried a chip on his shoulder. Growing up in a neighboring town, he had been taught to see people like Delilah as troublemakers, not community leaders. He didn't understand the struggles of this neighborhood, nor did he care to. To him, Delilah's table was an eyesore, a nuisance that challenged his perception of order. That day, something in Barnes snapped. Maybe it was the heat, maybe it was the crowd, or maybe it was the deep-seated prejudice he refused to acknowledge in himself. Whatever it was, he decided Delilah needed to be taught a lesson. As Barnes approached, his boots crunching against the gravel, Delilah looked up from her table. She recognized him immediately. His reputation had preceded him. Still, she met his gaze with calm defiance. "Afternoon, officer," she greeted, her voice steady but cautious. Barnes didn't return the pleasantry. Instead, he gestured to her table. "You got a permit for this?" Delilah frowned, confused by the sudden hostility. "A permit? I've been doing this for years, and no one's ever asked for a permit." "Well, I'm asking now," he replied, his tone sharp. "You're distributing food on public property. That's against the rules unless you've got authorization." Her hands tightened around the edge of the table, but she didn't falter. This isn't a business, officer. I'm just helping my neighbors. Barnes sneered. Helping? Looks to me like you're causing a disturbance. The exchange drew the attention of onlookers, their murmurs growing louder as they watched Barnes knock over the table. The sight of sandwiches and bottles scattering across the dirt sent a ripple of shock through the small crowd. Delilah stepped forward, her voice rising. What are you doing? This is for the kids. For the people who need it. You're trespassing, Barnes shot back, grabbing her wrist. And now you're resisting. Delilah's heart pounded as he forced her toward the trash bin. The murmurs of the crowd grew more urgent, but no one stepped in, fear paralyzing them. Barnes shoved her against the bin, pulling out zip ties to bind her wrists to the handle. You're going to regret this, Delilah said quietly, her voice firm despite the humiliation coursing through her veins. One way or another, you're going to regret this. Miles away, Marcus was finishing up paperwork when his phone buzzed with a call. It was a neighbor, her voice frantic. Marcus, it's your mom. She's in trouble. You need to get to the park. Now. He didn't need to hear anything else. Slamming the phone down, Marcus grabbed his keys and bolted out the door, a storm of anger and fear brewing inside him. He didn't know what he would find when he got there, but one thing was certain, no one laid a hand on Delilah Carter without consequences. The tires of Marcus's truck screeched against the asphalt as he tore into the parking lot, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. The familiar park, usually a place of laughter and life, now seemed shrouded in tension. A small crowd had gathered near the playground, their faces etched with concern and disbelief, but Marcus's focus was laser-sharp on the figure by the trash bin. There she was, his mother, Delilah Carter, her hands tied cruelly to the handle of the bin, her posture tense but unbroken. The sight ignited a fire in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Beside her stood Officer Barnes, his expression smug and self-assured, his arms crossed as if he were proud of what he'd done. Marcus slammed the door of his truck, his boots hitting the ground with purpose as he strode toward the scene. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, but Marcus didn't hear a word of it. His eyes locked onto Barnes, and his voice, low and sharp, cut through the air. Untie her. Now. Barnes turned slowly, clearly not expecting to see the sheriff of the county standing before him. For a moment, surprise flickered across his face, but it was quickly replaced by his usual arrogance. And who are you to give me orders? Barnes asked, his tone dripping with defiance. Marcus didn't break stride. I'm Marcus Carter, sheriff of this county, and that's my mother you've got tied up like trash. The crowd gasped audibly, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Barnes hesitated, his confidence faltering as he glanced from Marcus to Delilah. Sheriff or not, she's trespassing. Operating without a permit, he said, though his voice lacked the earlier venom. Marcus stopped a foot away from Barnes, his frame towering over him. His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge. A permit for what? Feeding people. Helping kids in a community that's been ignored by people like you for years. Barnes scoffed, though he took a small step back. The law is the law, Carter. You of all people should understand that. Don't talk to me about the law, Marcus said, his voice rising. The law doesn't give you the right to humiliate an elderly woman in front of her community. It doesn't give you the right to tear down what little good this neighborhood still has. Delilah, still tied but standing as tall as she could, spoke up. Marcus, don't waste your breath. Men like him don't listen. They don't care about justice, they care about control. Barnes snapped his head toward her, his face reddening. You better watch your mouth, lady. Marcus stepped in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. You'll show her respect, or I'll make sure you never wear that badge again. For a moment, Barnes looked as though he might retaliate, but the weight of Marcus's authority, and the glaring eyes of the crowd, kept him in check. Grudgingly, he reached for the zip ties and cut them loose. Delilah rubbed her wrists, wincing slightly, but her gaze never wavered. She refused to let Barnes see any sign of weakness. The crowd murmured, their relief mixed with anger. One voice called out, "You tell him, Sheriff." Another shouted, "We've had enough of this." The tension in the air was palpable, but Marcus raised a hand, quieting them. "Let's be clear about something," Marcus said, addressing the crowd but keeping his eyes on Barnes. "This park, this neighborhood, it belongs to you. Not to men like him, who think they can use their power to tear it down. If any of you ever feel unsafe, you come to me. I don't care if it's a broken window or a broken heart, you come to me." The crowd erupted in applause, but the moment was far from over. Barnes stood stiffly, his face a mask of barely contained anger. "You think you're some kind of hero, Carter? You think you can just walk in here and make everything right?" "I don't think, Barnes." "I know," Marcus replied coldly. "And if you ever step out of line again, you'll answer to me personally." Barnes glared at him, his jaw tightening. He muttered something under his breath and stormed back to his patrol car, his boots stomping against the ground. The crowd parted to let him pass, their expressions a mixture of contempt and satisfaction. As the patrol car roared out of the lot, Delilah placed a hand on Marcus's arm. "You didn't have to come, son. You've got enough on your plate without cleaning up my mess." "Don't call this a mess," Marcus said, turning to face her. His eyes softened as he looked at her wrists, red and raw from the ties. "You're out here doing what I can't, what most people won't. I'll always come when you need me." Delilah smiled faintly, though the weight of the day was evident in her posture. "This isn't over, Marcus. Men like him, they don't back down. They escalate." "I know," Marcus said, his tone grave. "That's why I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again. Not to you, not to anyone." The crowd began to disperse, though the hum of their conversations lingered. Marcus helped Delilah gather the scattered food and supplies, his mind racing with what needed to be done. He knew Barnes wouldn't let this go. The man's pride had been wounded, and Marcus had seen enough in his career to know that wounded pride was a dangerous thing. Later that evening, Marcus sat at his desk, poring over files and reports. He was determined to find anything he could use against Barnes, any complaint, any incident that had been swept under the rug. His instincts told him that this wasn't just about his mother. Barnes wasn't acting out of nowhere, there was something deeper at play. But as he delved deeper into the records, a pattern began to emerge, one that chilled him to the core. Barnes's actions weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger problem, one that reached higher than Marcus had anticipated. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was darker than Marcus had imagined. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched as the weight of what he was uncovering settled over him. This wasn't just about justice for his mother anymore. It was about the soul of the community, and the battle to save it was just beginning. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly in the corner of the sheriff's office as Marcus leaned forward in his chair, staring at the screen. His eyes were heavy from hours of research, but he couldn't stop now. The files he had uncovered on Officer Barnes painted a damning picture, a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and abuses of power spanning years. But what troubled Marcus most was how many complaints had quietly disappeared, buried under layers of bureaucracy. Someone had been protecting Barnes, and that someone had to be higher up. The faint knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Deputy Ann Fisher, one of the few people in the department Marcus trusted implicitly. She stepped inside, her expression cautious, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. "I found something," Ann said quietly, closing the door behind her. Marcus motioned for her to sit, his curiosity piqued. "What is it?" She handed him the folder, her face grim. "It's about Barnes. I went digging through old case logs, and it's worse than we thought." Marcus opened the folder and scanned the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing second. And continued, her voice low but firm. "There's a connection between Barnes and the district captain. Every complaint against him has been dismissed by Captain Hargrove. The same language, the same excuses, insufficient evidence, lack of corroboration. It's like a script." Marcus felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Hargrove had been his superior for years, a man he'd respected, at least until now. Why would Hargrove protect him? What's in it for him? And hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "That's the thing. I couldn't find a direct link, no money trail, no favors. But Barnes is useful to him. He enforces the unspoken rules, keeps certain people in line." Marcus slammed the folder shut, his frustration boiling over. "This isn't just about Barnes. This is systemic. It's about power, control, and fear." And nodded. "So, what do we do? You take this to Hargrove, and he'll bury it like everything else. You go public, and it could blow up in your face." Marcus stared at the folder, his mind racing. He knew and was right. If he confronted Hargrove directly, it could end his career. But if he stayed silent, he'd be complicit. And after what Barnes had done to his mother, silence wasn't an option. "We need leverage," Marcus said finally. "Something they can't deny or bury. If we're going to take them down, we need to hit hard and fast." And raised an eyebrow. "You have something in mind?" Marcus's gaze hardened. "I want to confront Barnes. I want him to know that I see him for what he is. And I want to give him the chance to come clean, before we drop the hammer." And looked skeptical but nodded. "You sure he won't just double down? Guys like Barnes don't scare easy." "He's not scared of me," Marcus said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "But he's terrified of losing the shield that protects him. Let's see what happens when he realizes it's crumbling." The drive to Barnes's house was tense, the air thick with unspoken questions. Anne rode shotgun, her hand resting on her radio, ready for anything. When they pulled up to the modest brick house on the outskirts of town, Marcus took a deep breath. This wasn't just about Barnes anymore, it was about everything he stood for. Barnes answered the door after a few loud knocks, his expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. "Sheriff," he said flatly. "What do you want?" Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Barnes crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "About what?" "Your mom. I told you, I was just doing my job." "This isn't about my mom," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing. "It's about you. About the complaints, the cover-ups, and the people you've hurt." Barnes scoffed, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "You're barking up the wrong tree, Carter. You don't have anything on me." Marcus held up the folder, his voice sharpening. "Don't I? This is just the beginning, Barnes. I've got years of your misconduct right here. And I know about Hargrove. You think he's going to protect you when this all comes crashing down?" Barnes's smirk faltered, replaced by a defensive glare. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," Marcus shot back. "You've spent your whole career hiding behind that badge, thinking it makes you untouchable. But let me tell you something, you're not untouchable. And neither is Hargrove." Barnes's fists clenched at his sides, his voice rising. "You think you're better than me? You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know what it's like out there, Carter. You don't know what it takes to keep people in line." Marcus took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "I know what it takes to serve and protect. And it's not this. It's not intimidation, or violence, or treating people like they're less than human." The silence that followed was heavy, the tension crackling like electricity. For a moment, Marcus thought Barnes might lash out, but instead, the officer let out a bitter laugh. "You're wasting your time," Barnes said, shaking his head. "Hargrove will bury this, just like he's buried everything else. You think you can win? You're fooling yourself. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. We'll see about that. As Marcus and turned to leave, Barnes called after them, his voice laced with desperation. You don't know what you're getting into, Carter. You take this any further, and you'll regret it. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. As he climbed back into the truck, his mind was already racing with the next steps. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, he knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice was just beginning. The office was silent except for the soft hum of Marcus's desk lamp. He sat alone, the folder of evidence spread out before him. The encounter with Barnes had been rattling, not because of fear, but because of the unmistakable crack he'd seen in the officer's armor. Barnes had slipped, his defensive tone, his poorly concealed panic, it all confirmed what Marcus already suspected. The man was scared. And scared people made mistakes. Marcus rubbed his temples, exhaustion creeping in, but he couldn't stop now. His mother's words echoed in his mind, men like him, they escalate. He needed to move quickly, to ensure that whatever Barnes and Hargrove planned, he was one step ahead. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Anne, her face tense but resolute. She held her phone in her hand, her knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. What is it? Marcus asked, his voice cautious. It's Barnes, Anne said, stepping inside. He's meeting someone at the station right now. I pulled up the security feed, it's Hargrove. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He's trying to cover his tracks. Anne nodded. It gets worse. They've got files with them. Looks like they're pulling everything they can on you. Marcus let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Of course they are. They know I'm coming for them. Anne hesitated, her voice dropping. Marcus, they're desperate. If they're willing to risk meeting like this, it means they're planning something big. You need to be careful. Marcus stood, grabbing his jacket. Careful isn't going to cut it anymore. We need to stop this, tonight. Anne stepped in front of him, her expression firm. You go in there now, guns blazing, and they'll bury you. You need leverage, something that forces them to back down. Marcus paused, her words sinking in. She was right. Charging into the station unprepared would only play into their hands. He needed undeniable proof, something that couldn't be dismissed or hidden. Then we get the proof, Marcus said finally. We catch them in the act. Anne frowned. You're suggesting surveillance? On your own department? It's not my department anymore, Marcus said, his voice hard. Not while Hargrove and Barnes are running it like their personal playground. Anne stared at him for a long moment before nodding. All right. Let's do it. The two of them worked quickly, setting up remote access to the station's security feed. Anne tapped into the audio system, her fingers flying over the keyboard as Marcus watched the screen. The grainy image of Hargrove and Barnes sitting in the back office filled the monitor, their voices crackling through the speakers. He's a problem, Barnes was saying, his tone agitated. He's got the files. If he takes this public, we won't let it get that far, Hargrove interrupted, his voice cold and calculated. We'll handle Carter before he has the chance. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He leaned closer, his fists clenching as he listened. How? Barnes asked, clearly nervous. He's the sheriff. We can't just, I'll take care of it, Hargrove snapped. You just do your part. Find something, anything, to discredit him. If we can't, we'll make something up. And glanced at Marcus, her expression grim. They're planning to frame you. Marcus didn't respond, his focus fixed on the screen. The conversation continued, the two men discussing forged documents and fabricated accusations. It was more than enough to expose them, but Marcus knew it wouldn't be enough to dismantle the entire system they'd built. He needed to go deeper. Do we have access to Hargrove's office? Marcus asked, his mind racing. And hesitated. Not remotely. But if you're thinking of going in, I am, Marcus said firmly. They've already crossed the line. It's time we do the same. And sighed, but there was no arguing with him now. All right. But we do this smart. I'll keep watch on the cameras, make sure you have a clear path. Marcus nodded, grabbing his badge and holster. He wasn't just doing this for himself or even for his mother. This was for every person Barnes and Hargrove had silenced, every family they had torn apart. The weight of that responsibility steadied him as he stepped out into the night. The station was quiet when Marcus arrived, the late hour ensuring most of the staff had gone home. Anne's voice crackled in his earpiece as he entered through the side door. Clear so far, she said. Hargrove and Barnes are still in the back office. Marcus moved quickly, his footsteps silent against the tiled floor. He made his way to Hargrove's office, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. Anne's voice guided him through the empty hallways, each step bringing him closer to the truth. When he reached the office, he paused, listening for any sign of movement. Satisfied that he was alone, he slipped inside and closed the door behind him. The room was dark, the faint glow of a computer screen casting eerie shadows across the walls. All right, Anne said in his ear. You're looking for anything that ties Hargrove to Barnes, emails, phone records, financial documents. Check the desk first. Marcus began searching, his movements swift but methodical. The desk drawers yielded little more than standard paperwork, but when he opened the bottom drawer, his breath caught. A locked file box sat inside, its surface scratched and dented from years of use. I found something, Marcus whispered. Need to get it open. Anne's voice was urgent. Hurry. Hargrove just left the back office, he's heading your way. Marcus grabbed a letter opener from the desk, jamming it into the lock. The metal groaned in protest before finally giving way. Inside the box were stacks of envelopes and folders, each one marked with names and dates. Marcus's hands trembled as he flipped through them, recognizing some of the names immediately, community leaders, activists, even former officers. These weren't just records, they were blackmail materials, evidence of a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Barnes. Marcus, you need to move, Anne said, her voice tight. Hargrove's almost there. Marcus grabbed the files, stuffing them into his bag as he made his way to the door. He cracked it open, peering into the hallway. Hargrove's footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. You've got one shot, Anne said. Go now. Marcus slipped out of the office, his heart hammering in his chest as he darted down the hallway. He could hear Hargrove's voice behind him, shouting orders, but he didn't stop. He reached the side door and burst into the cool night air, his lungs burning as he sprinted to his truck. Did you get it? Anne asked, her voice filled with urgency. Marcus threw the bag onto the passenger seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel. I got everything. As he drove away, the weight of what he carried pressed down on him. This was it, the proof he needed to bring down Barnes, Hargrove, and everyone else who had turned a blind eye. But he knew the hardest part was still ahead. The truth was out there now, and there would be no turning back. The glow of the laptop illuminated Marcus's face as he sat in his living room, the stolen files spread across the coffee table. Anne sat across from him, her expression a mix of determination and unease. The air was heavy with the enormity of what they were about to do. These files, Marcus began, flipping through one of the folders, they're more than enough to bring Barnes and Hargrove down. But they also implicate others. Judges, council members, even people I've worked with. Anne nodded, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. It's a spiderweb, Marcus. You pull one thread, and the whole thing unravels. That's the point, Marcus said, his voice low but firm. If we don't take all of them down, they'll just rebuild. Someone else will step into Hargrove's shoes, and nothing will change. And sighed, leaning back against the couch. You're talking about a full-scale exposure. You know what kind of backlash that's going to bring, right? They'll come after you, your family, your mom. Marcus's jaw tightened. The thought of Delilah being dragged into this war made his stomach churn, but he knew there was no other way. The people who had suffered under Hargrove's regime deserved justice, and justice didn't come without sacrifice. We don't have a choice, Marcus said finally. If we let fear stop us now, we're no better than they are. And studied him for a long moment before nodding. All right. But we need to be smart about this. If we go public, we need to control the narrative. Otherwise, they'll twist it. Marcus opened another folder, pulling out a stack of documents. This is our narrative. Dates, names, financial records, it's all here. Hargrove's been paying Barnes under the table for years to enforce his so-called order. Intimidation, false arrests, the works. And frowned, leaning forward. But why? What's the endgame? It's about power, Marcus said, his voice cold. Hargrove's been using Barnes to suppress anyone who challenges the system. Activists, community leaders, even cops who won't play along. And shook her head, disgust evident on her face. And the others? The judges, the council members, what's their angle? Marcus tapped the papers in front of him. They're all connected. Hargrove uses Barnes to keep the neighborhood under control, which keeps the crime stats low. That makes the city look good, which keeps the funding rolling in. Meanwhile, the judges dismiss complaints, and the council approves budgets that funnel money into Hargrove's pocket. And let out a low whistle. It's a well-oiled machine. It was, Marcus corrected. Not anymore. They spent the next several hours combing through the files, piecing together the puzzle and preparing their case. Every new detail they uncovered only deepened Marcus's resolve. By the time the sun began to rise, they had a plan, a risky, ambitious plan, but one that could change everything. Here's how we do this, Marcus said, laying out the strategy. We leak the files to the press, but not all at once. We start with Barnes, his name's already in the spotlight because of what he did to my mom. That'll get people's attention. And nodded, following his logic. And once the spotlight's on him, we connect the dots to Hargrove. Let the public see how deep it goes. Exactly, Marcus said. We control the story, one piece at a time. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late for damage control. And hesitated, her brow furrowing. And what about you? You think they're just going to sit back and let you expose them? Marcus met her gaze, his expression unflinching. I'm not afraid of them. And shook her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. You should be. But I guess that's what makes you, you. By the time Marcus arrived at the station later that morning, the atmosphere was already charged. News of Barnes's misconduct had spread like wildfire, fueled by the first batch of leaked documents. Officers whispered in corners, their faces a mix of shock and anger. Marcus could feel their eyes on him as he walked through the halls, but he didn't waver. In the briefing room, Hargrove was waiting. His expression was calm, but his eyes were anything but. Barnes stood beside him, his posture tense, his jaw clenched. Sheriff, Hargrove said, his voice smooth but laced with steel. We need to talk. Marcus stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. I figured you'd say that. Hargrove gestured to a chair, but Marcus remained standing. The silence stretched for a moment before Hargrove spoke again, his tone measured. You've stirred up quite a mess, Carter. Leaking department files to the press. That's a serious offense. Not as serious as what's in those files, Marcus shot back. You and I both know this isn't about me. It's about you. About Barnes. About every dirty deal you've made to protect your empire. Hargrove's jaw tightened, but his smile didn't falter. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? But you're just a man with a badge and a grudge. You don't have the power to bring me down. Marcus stepped closer, his voice low and sharp. I don't need power. I have the truth. And that's more than enough. Barnes shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Marcus and Hargrove. For the first time, Marcus saw real fear in his face. The cracks were spreading, and it was only a matter of time before the whole facade crumbled. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his smile fading. You're playing a dangerous game, Carter. You've got a lot to lose, your career, your reputation, your family. Are you willing to risk it all? Marcus didn't hesitate. For justice. Every damn time. The room fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. Hargrove's composure faltered, and for a brief moment, Marcus saw the man behind the mask, a man desperate to hold on to the power slipping through his fingers. You'll regret this, Hargrove said finally, his voice low and venomous. Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. No. You will. As Marcus walked out of the briefing room, he felt the weight of what was to come. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt the tide turning. The truth was out, and there was no stopping it now. The tension in the department was palpable as Marcus walked down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. Officers glanced up from their desks, their expressions wary and uncertain. The leaked documents had thrown the entire precinct into chaos. Rumors were swirling, about Barnes, about Hargrove, and about Marcus himself. But he didn't have time to address the whispers. There was still work to be done. Anne met him in his office, closing the door behind her quickly. Her face was tight, her movements deliberate as she laid a fresh stack of papers on his desk. You need to see this, she said, her voice low. Marcus sat down, flipping through the documents. Each page was damning, a paper trail that connected Hargrove to a series of kickbacks and under-the-table deals with local developers. The money had been funneled through dummy accounts, the transactions just subtle enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. But with the evidence in hand, the connections were undeniable. This is the final nail, Anne said, crossing her arms. We've got him. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. It's more than just Hargrove and Barnes, he muttered. This implicates half the city council. If we take this public, it's going to blow up in ways we can't control. Anne nodded, her expression grim. And you're sure that's what you want? Once this goes out, there's no taking it back. Marcus's jaw tightened. He thought of his mother, of the humiliation she had endured. He thought of the countless others who had suffered in silence under this corrupt system. Taking this public wasn't just about justice, it was about dismantling the very foundation of the power structure that had allowed this to happen. I'm sure, he said finally. This has to end. And didn't argue. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began drafting a press release. Marcus watched her for a moment, his thoughts still spinning. The weight of the decision he was making pressed heavily on him, but he knew there was no other choice. A sharp knock on the door interrupted them. Marcus looked up to see Officer Daniels, one of the younger deputies, standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his hands fidgeting nervously. Sheriff, Daniels began, his voice shaky. You need to come to the front desk. There's someone here to see you. Marcus frowned, rising from his chair. Who? Daniels hesitated. It's Hargrove. He's asking to speak with you. Marcus exchanged a glance with Anne, who quickly tucked the documents into her bag. Be careful, she whispered. This could be a trap. Marcus nodded, stepping past Daniels and heading toward the front desk. The air in the station felt heavier than ever, the weight of anticipation thick around him. As he rounded the corner, he saw Hargrove standing near the counter, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. Sheriff Carter, Hargrove greeted him, his tone measured. We need to talk. Privately. Marcus studied him for a moment, his instincts on high alert. Hargrove's usual smugness was gone, replaced by a controlled tension that set Marcus on edge. Follow me, Marcus said finally, leading Hargrove to a small conference room at the back of the station. He closed the door behind them, leaning against it as he crossed his arms. You've got 5 minutes, Marcus said. Make it count. Hargrove smirked faintly, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. He sat down at the table, his movements deliberate. I'm here to offer you a deal, he said simply. Marcus raised an eyebrow. A deal? Hargrove nodded. You and I both know how this ends if you keep pushing. The department falls apart. The city loses faith in law enforcement. You'll win the battle, but you'll lose the war. Marcus's expression didn't change. And what's your solution? Simple, Hargrove said, leaning forward. You drop this crusade, and I step down quietly. Barnes is already a lost cause, you can have him. But you leave the rest of us out of it. Marcus let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You think I'm going to let you walk away after everything you've done? I'm offering you stability, Hargrove countered, his tone sharpening. You take me down, and this department collapses. The city turns on you. You'll be the one holding the bag when everything falls apart. Marcus leaned in, his voice low and cold. This department collapsed the moment you put people like Barnes in charge. I'm not here to save your legacy, Hargrove. I'm here to destroy it. Hargrove's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing. You're making a mistake. No, Marcus said firmly. You made the mistake when you thought you could get away with this. Hargrove rose from his seat, his movements slow and deliberate. You're playing a dangerous game, Carter. I hope you're ready for the consequences. Marcus didn't flinch. I've been ready since the moment you put your hands on my mother. The room fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavily in the air. Hargrove stared at him for a long moment before turning and walking out, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. When Marcus returned to his office, and was waiting for him, her phone in hand. How'd it go? She asked. Marcus shook his head. He offered me a deal. Ann's eyebrows shot up. And? I turned him down, Marcus said simply. Ann smiled faintly. Good. Now let's finish this. Together, they finalized the release, sending the documents to the press with a detailed summary of their findings. It didn't take long for the story to spread. By the time the evening news aired, the city was in an uproar. Protests erupted outside the precinct, demanding accountability. Marcus watched the coverage from his office, his emotions a mix of relief and apprehension. This is it, Ann said, standing beside him. No turning back now. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the screen. Good. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city as Marcus watched the precinct through the blinds of his office. The station was quiet, almost eerily so. The usual hum of activity had been replaced by whispers and sidelong glances. Officers who once carried themselves with confidence now moved cautiously, their trust in leadership eroded by the revelations unfolding around them. Ann stood in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression thoughtful. They're on edge, she said quietly. Everyone's waiting for the other shoe to drop. Marcus turned to her, his face etched with exhaustion. It's not just the officers. It's the whole city. This isn't just a scandal, Ann. It's a reckoning. Ann nodded, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. You've got them on the ropes, Marcus. Hargrove, Barnes, all of them. But they're not going to go down without a fight. Marcus leaned against his desk, his arms crossed. I know. That's what worries me. People like Hargrove don't play by the rules. If they can't silence us with lies, they'll try something worse. Anne hesitated, her expression shifting to one of concern. You think they'll go that far? I know they will, Marcus said, his voice firm. We've exposed them, Anne. They're desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. Before she could respond, Marcus's phone buzzed on the desk. He picked it up, his stomach tightening when he saw the caller ID. It was Delilah. Mom, he answered quickly, his voice edged with concern. Everything okay? Her voice came through the line, calm but firm. I'm fine, Marcus. But there's someone outside the house. A car parked across the street. Been sitting there for over an hour now. Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. What kind of car? Black sedan, Delilah said. No plates. Anne's eyes widened as she caught the gist of the conversation. Marcus turned to her, his voice low and urgent. Get a unit over to my mom's house. Now. Anne nodded, pulling out her phone to make the call as Marcus turned his attention back to Delilah. Stay inside, Mom. Lock the doors and windows. I'm sending someone over. I'm not scared, Marcus, Delilah said, her tone resolute. But I'm not stupid either. I'll stay put. Marcus exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing slightly. Good. I'll be there soon. As he ended the call, and looked up from her phone. Unit's on its way. But Marcus, this feels like a message. It is, Marcus said grimly. Hargrove's trying to intimidate us. He wants me to know he's watching. Anne's expression darkened. And what are we going to do about it? Marcus grabbed his jacket, his movements sharp and deliberate. We're going to show him that it won't work. The drive to Delilah's house was tense, the silence in the car broken only by the sound of the engine. Marcus's mind raced, his thoughts a mix of anger and determination. He knew Hargrove was testing him, pushing to see how far he could be pushed. But Hargrove had underestimated one thing: Marcus didn't back down. When he pulled up to the house, the black sedan was gone, leaving only faint tire marks on the pavement. A patrol car was parked out front, and a young officer stood on the porch, talking to Delilah through the screen door. Marcus stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of the sedan. Sheriff, the officer greeted him as he approached. We didn't see anyone, but we'll keep an eye on the area. Good, Marcus said, his tone clipped. Stay vigilant. If you see anything suspicious, call it in immediately. The officer nodded, stepping aside as Marcus entered the house. Delilah was in the living room, sitting calmly with a cup of tea in her hands. Her composure was unshaken, but Marcus could see the worry in her eyes. You didn't have to come, she said as he sat down across from her. I can handle myself. I know you can, Marcus replied, his voice softening. But I needed to see for myself that you were okay. Delilah smiled faintly, her gaze steady. I raised you to fight for what's right, Marcus. I knew it would come with risks. But this isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone who's been hurt by that system. Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. And that's why we're not stopping. No matter what they try. Delilah reached out, placing a hand on his. Then you need to be careful. They're losing control, and that makes them dangerous. I know, Marcus said quietly. But they need to understand that they can't scare us into silence. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Marcus stood, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered weapon as he moved to answer it. And stood on the porch, her expression tense. We've got a problem, she said, stepping inside. Hargrove just called a press conference. He's accusing you of fabricating evidence. Marcus felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. Of course he is. He's trying to discredit me before the next wave of documents hits. Anne nodded. It's a desperate move, but it's going to sow doubt. If he gets ahead of this, it could undermine everything we've worked for. Marcus's mind raced as he considered their options. He knew the truth was on his side, but the court of public opinion could be swayed by a well-timed lie. He needed to act quickly to counter Hargrove's narrative. "We'll respond," Marcus said finally. "But not with words. With proof. We'll release the next batch of documents tonight, everything we have on Hargrove and Barnes. Let the public see the full extent of their corruption." And hesitated. "Are you sure? Once this is out, there's no turning back." Marcus met her gaze, his expression resolute. "There never was." They worked late into the night, preparing the files for release. The documents were detailed and damning, painting a picture of a system built on lies, greed, and abuse of power. By the time the sun rose, the files were in the hands of every major news outlet in the city. As Marcus watched the first reports break on the morning news, he felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The fight was far from over, but the truth was finally out. Now, it was up to the people to decide what would come next. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. Cameras lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the rows of seats filled with reporters, activists, and members of the community. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture straight and his expression calm. But inside, his heart raced. Months of tireless work had led to this moment. The files he had unearthed, the evidence he and Ann had meticulously compiled, the media storm they had ignited, it all culminated here. Across the room, Hargrove sat stiffly with his lawyer, his face a mask of defiance. Barnes was nowhere to be seen. The disgraced officer had folded under the weight of the evidence against him, striking a plea deal that spared him the worst of the charges in exchange for testimony. His absence only underscored the crumbling foundation of Hargrove's empire. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The trial proceeded with an intensity that left no room for doubt. Witness after witness testified, their words painting a damning picture of corruption and abuse. Marcus took the stand last, his voice steady as he recounted the web of lies and intimidation that had plagued his community for years. "This was never about one bad cop," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the courtroom. "It was about a system that allowed him to thrive. It was about people in power who chose to protect themselves instead of the people they swore to serve." The weight of his words lingered in the air as the prosecution rested its case. By the time the verdict was read, the tension in the room was unbearable. But when the words, "guilty on all charges," echoed through the chamber, the silence broke into cheers. Outside the courthouse, the mood was electric. Protesters celebrated, their chants of justice filling the air. Reporters jostled for interviews, but Marcus ignored them. He stood on the courthouse steps, taking in the scene. This was what his mother had always believed in, the power of truth, the strength of community. And joined him, a rare smile breaking across her face. "We did it," she said simply. "No," Marcus replied, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "They did it. We just gave them the tools." In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the trial were felt across the city. Hargrove's conviction led to a wave of resignations and arrests, each one unraveling another layer of corruption. For the first time in years, the community felt a sense of hope. Barnes's deal meant he avoided prison time, but he was stripped of his badge and publicly disgraced. Unable to find work, he quietly left the city, his departure unnoticed and unmourned. Delilah, ever the pillar of strength, returned to her work in the park. But this time, she wasn't alone. Her food table became a hub of activity, with volunteers stepping up to help. It was a symbol of what the community could achieve when they stood together. As for Marcus, the trial had cemented his reputation as a man of integrity. Offers poured in from across the state, positions in larger departments, opportunities in politics, but he turned them all down. He stayed where he was needed most, leading his department with the fairness and compassion that had always defined him. One afternoon, as Marcus stood in the park watching kids play on the newly repaired playground, Delilah joined him. She handed him a bottle of water, her smile warm. "You did good, son," she said. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "You're the one who taught me how." Delilah's eyes twinkled with pride. "Then I did something right." As the screen fades to black, let's take a moment to reflect. What does this story teach us? It shows us the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. It reminds us that justice isn't just a word, it's an action, one that requires courage, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief in the truth. How many times have we witnessed or experienced injustice and felt powerless to stop it? But like Marcus, we all have the capacity to make a difference. Change starts with accountability, and accountability starts with people like you and me refusing to stay silent. What did you think about Marcus's journey? Did it resonate with you? What would you have done in his shoes? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and continue this conversation. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more tales of resilience and justice, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Don't forget to hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we can shine a light on the stories that matter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.